Our speakers today are Ed Salter, who is the Senior Marine Planning and Consents Manager at the Crown Estate, who will shortly do a brief introduction to the webinar today, and Andrea Hamel, who is the Senior Marine Archaeologist at Wessex Archaeology. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Ed. Ed, are you there?
Thank you very much, Maddie, and good morning, everyone. Pleased to be joining you all today. So as Maddie said, my name's Ed Salter. I'm Senior Marine Planning and Consents Manager at the Crown Estate, and I work as part of our marine planning team. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce today's webinar to you, and I'm just going to say a few words by way of background, really, before passing on to Andrea, who's going to take you through the new guidance in more detail. Just in terms of who I am, for those of you who don't know me, I'm part of our marine planning team, as I already mentioned, at the Crown Estate. I joined the organisation back in 2018, but prior to that I worked in environmental consultancy and as part of the marine planning team at Historic England prior to that. So my background is actually in consenting in the historic environment. In terms of the project itself, it originated back in 2010 when, as part of the enabling actions for round 3, the Crown Estate funded Wessex Archaeology to produce a guidance document that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, known as Model Clauses for Archaeological Written Schemes of Investigation. The aim of this guidance was to set out responsibilities and methodologies that should be included within WSIs, and that was to support the delivery of archaeological considerations and mitigation as part of the development of an offshore wind farm. However, fast forwarding to 2020 now, we decided that the guidance was in need of a refresh and update, there being several reasons for this. We felt there was obviously a clear need to reflect the learning from the last 10 years of practical delivery by the industry through round 1 to round 3, and obviously the changes that have taken place in that time, both to the industry itself, but also to the archaeological guidance, processes and procedures that had come about in that time. We also wanted to address gaps not included in the original guidance and reflect the full role of WSIs and archaeological mitigation in the development life cycle. So, for example, looking at those gaps in terms of content covering operations and maintenance and decommissioning, for example. One of the other key aims, we wanted to create a more plain English user-friendly digital version of the document, ensure consideration of new and emerging technologies such as floating wind, and obviously critically in terms of where we are now today and the future growth of the industry, ensure that the guidance remains appropriate and relevant to projects being brought forwards, obviously through the round 3 extensions. Round 4 are looking to the future as well. So with all that in mind, we commissioned Wessex Archaeology, authors of the original guidance, to undertake the update in 2020. The project itself was managed by a steering group which included representatives from the heritage agencies across the UK, including Historic England, the Royal Commission of Ancient Historical Monuments of Wales, and colleagues in Scotland as well. The guidance itself was developed in consultation with representatives from industry and a broad range of stakeholders, and obviously that consultation was a pivotal part which informed the final content and the version that we have before us now today. We're very pleased with the outcome. I definitely think it's going to be a really useful and important document going forwards, and sincerely hope that the new guidance is going to help all those involved in the offshore wind industry across the piece, be it industry, consultants, practitioners, heritage agencies, to navigate the archaeological requirements and the role of WSIs for offshore wind farms going forwards. So that's really all I'd like to say by way of introduction. I think now I'll pass on to Andrea, who's going to provide some further information and run you through the detail of the guidance itself. Thank you, and over to you, Andrea.
Thanks, Ed.
I'm Andrea Hamel, and I'm a Senior Marine Archaeologist with Wessex Archaeology. And I've been working on offshore wind farm projects for the last 12 or 13 years through various aspects, from scoping all the way through to operations and maintenance projects. But what I really want to do today is focus on the new document from the Crown Estate and Wessex Archaeology, the Archaeological Written Schemes of Investigation for Offshore Wind Farm Projects. And as Ed mentioned, the guidance is intended to be applicable for the ongoing projects in round 3, but also for round 4 and beyond, and it can be applied across the UK. So in the course of developing applications for consent, the historic environment is addressed through the process of environmental impact assessment. And this process identifies potential impacts from the development on archaeological features and identifies the mitigation measures to minimize the significance of the effects. These mitigation measures are secured through planning conditions requiring the production and implementation of a written scheme of investigation. But it should be noted right at the outset that it's the implementation of the mitigation from the written scheme of investigation that discharges the planning conditions rather than the production of the document itself. So the aims of this guidance, we have quite a number, but we'll go through each one. The first one is to facilitate the consenting process. Now, during the environmental impact assessment process, as we've said, the impact of development on archaeological features is assessed, and any significant effects can be addressed and minimized with mitigation. However, what do we mean by with mitigation? So this document enables agreement of common methodologies for mitigation in advance, which provides increased certainty about the detail of mitigation actions that are needed and thus promotes greater confidence in determining the possible residual effects with mitigation. Secondly, the guidance aims to inform the preparation of a written scheme of investigation during the EIA process. So it can be used almost as a checklist to show what kind of things need to be included, or as a slight template. So really helping out with this creation of a WSI. The guidance aims to provide an approach as to how written schemes of investigation can be applied pre and post consent to ensure that everyone involved in the process is aware of the mitigation likely to be required. The guidance also aims to provide greater certainty for the offshore wind farm project team so that they know what to accommodate in their post-consent plans for site investigation and construction. And finally, the guidance aims to encourage an open and level playing field for the provision of archaeological services by contractors. So what is a written scheme of investigation? Well, basically, a written scheme of investigation forms an umbrella document for all survey, investigation, and assessment that is required for the offshore wind farm project. And while it provides this overarching framework, it's supported by activity-specific method statements. So I quite like lists. So I wanted to talk about 5 things a written scheme of investigation does. So first of all, the written scheme of investigation sets out the roles and responsibilities of everyone involved. And this way, everyone involved can figure out how they're going to work together. It's quite important because while the guidance goes through discussing the offshore wind farm project team, that could compose different organizations and different people working on the project at different stages. So you'd have the development team, the construction team, the operations and maintenance team, and then the decommissioning team, but also outside of them, working with consultants, archaeological curators, regulators, retained archaeologists and archaeological contractors. There'd be contractors taking on individual works packages, and then depending on the specialties of the retained archaeologist, there may also be archaeological geophysicists being brought in and geoarchaeologists as well. So you can really see there's a lot of people involved in bringing together the offshore wind farm project. So other things that a WSI does, well, it outlines the known and potential archaeological receptors that could be impacted by the scheme. And these are identified by the environmental impact assessment through the desk-based assessment, which will have gathered data together from national databases and from the UK Hydrographics Office. They'll also have been identified through archaeological assessments of geophysical and geotechnical survey data. But instead of having to go to the technical reports or the environmental statement every time you need to look for something, the written scheme of investigation will summarize the important points and have that information at hand. The WSI also outlines the agreed mitigation and archaeological actions that are to take place in various circumstances. And again, these will have been set out in the environmental impact assessment process, but in the written scheme of investigation, they can be developed in a bit more detail. Fourth, the WSI sets out the importance of research frameworks in setting out objectives. So the offshore wind farm development really provides a fantastic opportunity to address research objectives and thus contribute to our wider understanding of the archaeology of the area. But in order to maximize this, these objectives really need to be taken into consideration at the early stage of planning different surveys and activities. And finally, the WSI provides summarized details on methodology for the archaeological actions that are required. And the WSI pulls all of these things together, and the WSI also applies to the entire life cycle of the project. So we've put together an indicative example timeline in the guidance, so you can kind of see how the WSI is used and how it's used at different phases and what's required. And the example has been based on English and Welsh examples, but it's generally applicable for projects in Scotland and Northern Ireland as well. So at the pre-consent phase, there's a concept of a written scheme of investigation that applies to data gathered as part of this environmental impact assessment process. And this develops into an outline WSI, which forms the framework for the assumed mitigation that will be submitted with the development consent order application. Following the outline WSI, this then becomes the draft WSI, which is agreed with the regulator prior to surveys taking place to ensure that archaeological objectives are taken into account. Then once a project has gained consent, a final agreed WSI will be produced post-consent to set out overarching approaches to survey and archaeological investigations agreed by the regulator prior to pre-construction works commencing. This final agreed WSI outlines when supporting archaeological methodologies will be required and to who and how they are to be submitted for approval prior to work commencing. So at the end of this post-consent phase, we have the agreed framework WSI that will cover all further works. So any further work being undertaken will be covered by method statements. So at the pre-construction phase, specific details of methodologies will be set out in method statements to agree the approach to each survey or work package undertaken and to set out the archaeological deliverables that are likely to be resulting. Moving to the construction phase, there will also be a construction method statement, and it will gather together all of the data sets from the written scheme of investigation and anything else that's come to light following surveys in the pre-construction phase. So it'll bring all of this information together and include the archaeological mitigation set out during construction. And it's really key to have all of the data being brought forward because quite often it will be a different team involved at the construction phase. So once again, it's really just making sure that everyone in the project is on board. Post-construction, there may also be a method statement for post-construction monitoring. So this could be looking at survey data. For example, if there's a possibility of scour at the location of the turbine bases, there may be post-construction geophysical surveys undertaken, and then these could be used for archaeological assessment just to see whether there's been any archaeological material exposed in the areas where scour has taken place. At the operations and maintenance phase, there'll be another method statement that will cover the operations and maintenance activities, because again, it could be working with a different group of people or different organizations. So it's really just making sure everyone has all the information they need for the work. At decommissioning, for a lot of these projects, they're so far in the future that there may be an updated environmental impact assessment, which would lead to an updated written scheme of investigation which again would draw on the previous written scheme of investigation and all of the information that's been gained through the life cycle of the project. And then further method statements would be developed in order to address specific activities being undertaken for decommissioning. So the key here is really that the written scheme of investigation covers the entire life cycle of the project, but that individual method statements will set out specific details. So the way the guidance has been laid out is to generally follow an example offshore wind farm project. So it starts with the production of method statements and goes all the way through to archiving and reporting. However, every single project is different and mitigation may be required at different phases. Additionally, there may be some types of mitigation and archaeological surveys that then lead to a different area. So it could almost work as a web, or you really need to think of many of these things as interconnected. So in order to make the guidance really easy for people to dip in and dip out of and to know which things kind of happen in which sort of topic, we've done some color coding. So the pink ones are mitigation, the green ones are for archaeological assessments, and then the blue topics are other elements that are applicable to all written schemes of investigation and method statements. And what we'll do now is just go through each one in a little bit more detail to talk about how they fit into the process. So archaeological method statements. Well, the written scheme of investigation will set out what method statements will be needed for, what they'll comprise, when they'll be submitted for agreement, and all sorts of details about just how method statements will be used throughout the project. Then the individual method statements will be produced to provide details of mitigation. So for example, for each package of works with archaeological relevance. Now this might be a geophysical survey that's undertaken to assess the specific location of where turbines are going to be positioned, but this data can be used for archaeological assessment, so it would need a method statement. Or it could be for archaeological involvement in an unexploded ordnance survey, where again, it's a package of works that's being undertaken for the wind farm project, but the data can be used by archaeologists to address archaeological objectives. But method statements may also be needed for specific archaeological investigations where the objective is entirely archaeological and will be led by an archaeologist. So the first type of archaeological survey I want to talk about is marine geophysical investigations. And the reason this is so early in the guidance is because the archaeological assessment of marine geophysical data can take place very early on, so as part of the environmental impact assessment process. So it is important to start thinking about it early on in the process. Now, with the marine geophysical investigations, we'll be looking at identifying features of interest on the seabed. So using side-scan sonar or multi-beam bathymetry, we'd be looking for features such as shipwrecks, aircraft crash sites, and then potential archaeological features that perhaps at this stage we can't identify in any detail, but we can start to think about the fact that they could be of interest and should be looked at in more detail if they're going to be impacted. We'd also be identifying features under the seabed. So for example, using sub-bottom profiler data to look for potential paleolandscape features, and things like magnetometer to look for buried or exposed metal features on the seabed. In any case, the key to dealing with marine geophysical investigations is that it's important to include archaeologists and archaeological advice at the planning stages of any investigations to ensure that the geophysical survey will provide data that's suitable for archaeological assessment and will maximize the results. And there are many opportunities in an offshore wind farm project to gather the data once, but then be able to use it many times. Now, geophysical survey investigations are also interesting within the life cycle of a project because they don't necessarily just happen once. So these marine geophysical investigations could be undertaken, as we mentioned, as part of the environmental impact assessment stage, where you're just getting a general idea of what's in the area, or they might be used post-consent to determine the specific location of a turbine. So there might be a very high resolution survey looking at specific turbine locations. Or indeed, they could be involved post-construction, where you're looking at areas of scour. So really, this is one where, although it's one topic, it comes into its own at various stages throughout the project. And the level of archaeological assessment that'll be undertaken at each phase will depend on the type of survey, the type of data that's acquired, on the objectives of that investigation. And this is why method statements can really make sure that the investigations are tailored to getting the best results at each phase. When we're looking in more detail at marine geoarchaeological investigations, this is when we're looking to find out a little bit more about paleo landscapes and what evidence we can get from areas of the seabed that used to be dry land. And this is another great example of where you're gathering the data once and using it many times. So geotechnical data will be gathered for refining the design, to look at layout options, and for discharging licensing conditions. But this data can also be used for archaeological purposes. However, once again, it's important to include archaeological advice at the planning stages in order to ensure the suitability of data and to maximize these results. Now, with marine geoarchaeological investigations, again, this is the kind of thing where you can have method statements at various stages of the assessment. So you'd have archaeological involvement in planning the marine geotechnical works, such as fiber coring and boreholes. And then you might have a method statement specifically for the archaeological assessment of the borehole logs. Now, once you've got the method statement, then the assessment can be undertaken, and the results of that assessment will then lead on to decide what happens next. So in some cases, if it's just bedrock on the seabed and there's no chance of anything archaeological being discovered, then that might be the end of it. That might just be where that work stops for that project. However, in areas where there is archaeological potential, this might lead on to another method statement, which will specifically set out the methodology for the next steps. So that might be getting into laboratory recording and subsampling of vibrocore data. It could be sample assessments, scientific dating, analysis and reporting, with each stage leading on to the next. But this provides a really nice controlled way for the retained archaeologist to set out what needs to happen, for the client and the curators and the regulator to be involved in deciding what happens next. Now, following the surveys, all being incorporated, with all the data being incorporated into the environmental impact assessment, mitigation measures can be outlined. So we're now into the pink slides. So this is mitigation measures. And quite often, the first form of mitigation that's considered will be leaving material in situ on the seabed and just not impacting it, because that's quite, in cases where things could be designed around it, this is a good way to leave the material where it is. And this is done through implementing archaeological exclusion zones, or AEZs. And these will be implemented around sites of known archaeological potential, and no works that impact the seabed will take place within an archaeological exclusion zone. During the environmental impact assessment stage, at the early stages, when you're just working on a desk-based assessment, you might only have data from the UK Hydrographics Office or from the national curators. And at this stage, you may not know much more than where the site is located. So you might have a dot on a map or a chart that tells you where the shipwreck is. And so at this stage, you might have archaeological exclusion zones that are just a buffer of a set distance as in a circle around that dot. However, as you gain more information, so for example, through the archaeological assessment of the geophysical survey data, you can then refine and amend these archaeological exclusion zones so that they really reflect the material that's on the seabed. So as you can see in the picture here, in this case, it's just around the material that you can see, but in some cases, AEZs could take into account areas of scour or any other things that need to be taken into account about the site on the seabed. So they really can be very site specific. AEZs can also be implemented post environmental impact assessment. So although at environmental impact assessment and the AEZs are agreed for consent, but new ones can be implemented if new material comes to light at further stages during the life cycle of the project. Additionally, AEZs could even be removed. So for example, if it turns out that the material that's on the seabed is not actually of archaeological interest. For example, sometimes you have historic records in the data sets that say, oh, a ship was lost here. And you've done the survey and you think, I don't know, we're not sure there's anything there. But further surveys have definitely determined that it's an area of, say, bedrock. There's nothing there. Then the archaeological exclusion zone could then be removed. And this method of mitigation works really well for things that we know are on the seabed and we know are of archaeological interest. So we're thinking here known shipwrecks, known aircraft crash sites, things of very high potential. So things that look like debris fields, or they're maybe not a confirmed wreck site, but the evidence on the seabed suggests very strongly that it's a site of archaeological significance. But what about the possibly hundreds of features of potential archaeological interest that have been identified through geophysical survey? Well, in this case, we can recommend different options. So first of all, for many projects, the easiest, least expensive thing to do might just be to avoid all of those features. So it might be possible to microsite the development around the potential archaeological features. So just moving a cable route slightly in one direction, or slightly shifting the position of a planned turbine. However, if the sites can't be avoided, so if there will definitely be impact to these geophysical anomalies of archaeological potential, then further assessment would be needed to characterize them and really understand them before any impact takes place. So for example, this could be through an ROV or diver survey, but if it turns out to be something of interest, it might be leading to further mitigation, such as excavation of significant sites. And what types of investigation will we use? Well, let's have a look at those. So there could be non-archaeological diver and ROV surveys. This is another great example of gathering the data once, but using it for many purposes. So we know for a lot of the offshore wind farms, there will be things like unexploded ordnance inspections being undertaken or pre-clearance surveys. And in these cases, if there's going to be an ROV or diver survey, then by involving archaeologists at the planning stages of that survey, we can ensure that the data that's gathered can be used for archaeological assessment. So for example, with an unexploded ordnance inspection, it might be the kind of thing where the UXO team provides the data to the archaeologists through daily reports and target investigation reports, so that the retained archaeologist can look at the data and say, okay, these sites are not of archaeological interest, or these ones are, we're going to want to do a bit more investigation there. And this might lead to an archaeological diver or ROV based assessment. So for example, for a particularly significant site, as an example, this might be the kind of thing where if you'd had the archaeological assessment of geophysical survey data and it had identified a site on the seabed that looked interesting, but we couldn't identify it. And then during the unexploded ordnance survey, the ROV that went to look at the site looked at it and said, oh, this is definitely a wooden shipwreck that hasn't previously been identified. This might be the time to involve an archaeological assessment where the entire goal of the assessment will be to deal with archaeological objectives. And that kind of assessment would be to characterize the site, to provide sufficient information for further discussions with an archaeological curator, or it might even be using this type of work to recover material or fully excavate a site. So this is where we have the surveys led by the archaeologist to assess a site. There may also be archaeological watching briefs, and this is basically any time that you have an archaeologist present on site during works. So examples could be on board during a pre-lay grapnel run, or for example, if you're in an area of high archaeological potential. So there's a possibility that things that are recovered could be of archaeological interest, but it's not a case where you know for sure it's of archaeological interest. So that would be dealt with more through archaeological survey, which we discussed previously. Archaeological watching briefs also take place in the intertidal zone during trench excavation for cable laying, as seen in this picture. Now we're back to mitigation, because even though you've gone through all of these surveys and all of these archaeological assessments and done everything you can to make sure that the archaeology has been managed, there's always the potential for unexpected discoveries that are just completely not expected to be there. And so a protocol for archaeological discoveries provides this safety net. And what a protocol will do is it's a process or a framework that enables any of the contractors working on different phases of the project to report any discoveries that are made to the retained archaeologist. So through the protocol, there'll be a written document that provides the details of how everyone works together and how things are reported. But there'll also be awareness visits where the retained archaeologist will discuss in detail with the contractors what types of material will be of interest, how reporting can be undertaken, and then how to handle or store finds as sort of first aid for archaeological things until further investigation can take place. In some cases, if material is reported through a protocol and it turns out to be particularly significant, this could then lead to the implementation of temporary exclusion zones where works are paused in the area, which will enable enough time for the retained archaeologist to develop method statements for further investigation to be agreed with the archaeological curators and be able to be set into action, but in a controlled manner. Now, as Ed mentioned, one of the key things with this guidance is that we wanted to take into consideration some things that were missing from the previous one. So the written scheme of investigation that's set up for each project should take into consideration post-construction monitoring, operations and maintenance, and decommissioning activities. But at the stage where the WSI is being written, it's still fairly early days, and we don't necessarily have a lot of details. So this is why there'd be method statements for each of these actions. Now, for post-construction monitoring, the key at this stage is to assess the effectiveness maybe of archaeological exclusion zones, so to determine whether or not there has actually been any work or any impact within those protected areas. Or it might be getting involved in any new features that may have been exposed, for example, through scour pits or other areas. At the operations and maintenance phase, the key thing for the method statement here is to ensure that the mitigation that's gone through the life cycle of the process so far is continued onto the operations and maintenance phase. So for example, it would ensure that any existing AEZs from the WSI or any further works are retained at this stage. It would be ensuring that the operations and maintenance team is aware of features of potential archaeological interest, and this will ensure that the activities of operations and maintenance, such as anchoring or repairing cables, will not affect those features. There will also be a protocol for archaeological discoveries so that if there are any chance finds, they can be reported to a retained archaeologist and then managed appropriately. At decommissioning, you'd be looking at likely similar things to operations and maintenance. So again, it's the idea that you're retaining any of the archaeological exclusion zones that have been established throughout the life cycle of the process, knowing the features of archaeological potential, knowing if there's any areas of high archaeological interest, and then there'll be specific method statements for the decommissioning activities to ensure that archaeological objectives are included where required. Now with this, we move into blue slides. So topics that are important for all archaeological written schemes of investigation and for method statements. So in the project-specific written scheme of investigation, you might have fairly generic guidance recommending how these features will be managed. So how archaeological recording will be done, how samples will be taken, how artifacts will be handled, and a brief thing about conservation. So really, again, the WSI is setting out this framework for further works that will be undertaken. But when you get to specific method statements for specific work packages, so if we return to this example of a wooden shipwreck that's been discovered on the seabed, well, the method statement for the archaeological recovery of material from this shipwreck would have very detailed information about how the site's going to be recorded, what kind of samples are going to be taken, and what is needed for, say, dendrochronological assessment, how these artifacts are going to be handled and stored, and as a key thing with wooden artifacts, conservation issues it would be really important to have them set out in the work method statement so that it can be agreed with the archaeological curators before the works take place. Now, although data management, reporting, publication, and archiving have been put at the end of the guidance, this is a topic that's really applicable to the development of the written scheme of investigation and for each method statement. And really, it's something that needs to be thought about right at the beginning of the document because it's such a key topic. And for me, having this at the end really highlights the circular nature of the guidance, where the different stages of work flow into one another, but they all remain interconnected and really held together by the framework of the written scheme of investigation.